Right, can those arriving in the meeting please keep your videos off? Thank you very much. Right, we'll make a start. So welcome everybody. My name is Marianne Jump and I'm the Archivist and Library Manager at the Marx Memorial Library. I'll introduce our special guest speaker in just a moment, but I will start with some housekeeping and a brief introduction to the Marx Memorial Library, then we'll get started. I have been asking you all to please keep your videos off, and we have you on mute at the moment, but that's not to say we won't have a chance for Q&A. John will be speaking for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be taking some questions. We are asking everybody to direct questions into the chat. I think hopefully you're all familiar with the chat function on Zoom. There's a little speech bubble at the bottom of your screens. So as questions occur to you, please do pop them in the chat and I'll be directing them to as many of them as possible at the end to John. We are recording this lecture, so we'll be putting this up on our website later, so you can revisit it. And we're also live on Facebook. So it's our original intention to hold a special lecture with John McDonnell, our Vice President, as part of our annual general meeting in April this year. Of course, for obvious reasons, we've had to postpone this, but we are delighted to host this keynote online event in its place. For those of you who are less familiar with the Marx Memorial Library and our work, we are a library, archive, museum and education charity based in Clerkenwell in Islington, with a very radical history in its own right. We have an internationally significant library and archive on Marxism and the history of socialism, a phenomenal collection of over 60,000 books and publications. And we organise a dynamic education programme working with schools, trade unions, local communities, delivering classes, lectures, exhibitions, and much more. And we also produce an annual journal with Liverpool University Press, which is just out now. It's free to all members. So we do encourage you to please take a look at our website, have a look at what we're up to, and join. I think that's enough from me. John McDonnell, former Shadow Chancellor, MP for Hayes and Harlington, needs very little introduction from me. He's a long-standing friend of the Marx Memorial Library, speaking at a plenary session in our Marx Bicentenary Conference in May 2018 at SOAS. And he's been Vice President of the MML for around 18 months now. His inaugural lecture back in October 2018, we had a special general meeting, was so oversubscribed that having addressed the 60 or 70 or so in our main hall, he then addressed a crowd on Clerkenwell Green, which was fantastic. And I think we've got the kind of online equivalent now with lots of people signing in, and also our live stream on Facebook. But of course, times have changed dramatically in the past 18 months, internationally, politically, and economically. So I think we're all really excited to hear from John this evening on the subject of the impact of the current crisis and the potential for a more egalitarian approach to the economy in its aftermath. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction, Ray, and thanks to the Marx Memorial Library for inviting me to speak. As was said, last time I spoke under the auspices of the library, we were physically present in the large room, and there was a queue around the corner as we squeezed people into the building. I just look forward to the day when we can all be in each other's company again, and the library can physically open its doors to continue to play the vital role it's always played, the educational role, which has played so well over the years. By the way, look, let me appeal to anyone who's with us online at the moment who's not a member of the library. Please join. You'll have access to a wonderful resource. It's amazing. And in the coming period of what I think will be of heightened political engagement, we will need the library not just as a welcoming premises to meet, but also vitally important as a facilitator of the study and the analysis and the intensive discussion we will need as we seek to advance socialist solutions to the crises we face. But let me start by acknowledging that in the week when American cities are alight with protest at the murder of George Floyd, no discussion should or can ignore the violence in all its forms meted out to our brothers and sisters from the Black and minority ethnic communities. Of course, we condemn the murder of Mr. Floyd, and we support those that have risen up in protest at this further example of police violence against Black people in the US. Let me say, I also condemn the behavior of Donald Trump, threatening to use the army against his own people. For too long, Trump has been treated as some Neanderthal throwback, a figure of derision. This man is dangerous. He's a dangerous demagogue with fascist tendencies. And all those who uphold democracy and human rights should call him out as one. We may be limited in what action, what sanctions we can level against him. And I support those who are calling now for no policing or anti-terrorism or other forms of equipment be exported to the US that could be used against those who are rising up at the moment. But also there's one other thing we can make explicitly clear, that this man is not welcome in this country and will never be invited here again. So Trump is not welcome here. But let's not live under any illusion that there isn't an issue of state violence against BAME community members in this country. Let me quote that wonderful upholder of civil liberties, the human rights group Inquest, which I've supported over the years. Inquest confirms, and I quote, "To date, there have been 1,741 deaths in police custody or otherwise in this country following contact with the police in England and Wales since 1990. And I just go on to quote Inquest's statement. It reads like this: BAME people died disproportionately as a result of the use of force or restraint by the police, raising serious questions of institutional racism as a contributory factor in their deaths. So I think if anything of value comes out of the tragic loss of George Floyd's life, let's try and make sure it's a renewed focus on the racism within all our societies and how we combat it. I have a fear that the economic impact of this pandemic, the recession, and the potential economic depression it's engendering could provide the ideal breeding ground for the further rise of the racist right in all its degenerate forms. So that's one of the many reasons why we on the left need to lead the debate on the post-pandemic economy and society that we need. We can't allow the future to be claimed by the right, as happened after the 2007-2008 banking crisis. Boris Johnson, with his at times farcical attempts to portray himself as the Churchill of our times, tried to seize the moment of the pandemic crisis to his political advantage. However, I think the Cummings debacle and the tragic mounting number of deaths have demonstrated to many more now that his combination of incompetence and his weak leadership is certainly no preening Chamberlain or Anthony Eden. And I've commented previously that Johnson's wartime analogies never took hold for me. The only benefit was they served as a reminder that even in the depths of the Second World War, when things were looking bleak, really bleak, progressives and socialists came together to do two things. First was to look back to the 1930s Depression years and proclaim never again. And then they went on to dream, yes, but also to discuss and to plan the economy and the society they aimed to build after the war was over. And I think that's the role the left can and should play now. I think it's the role that the left has a responsibility to play, because if we don't, certainly the right will not let this crisis go to waste, as they did ensure the banking crisis of 2000, 2008 didn't go to waste. Let's just have a quick recap on how we've got here and make some estimate of what we potentially face. For a decade, we've lived in the shadow of the banking crisis of 2007, 2008. The bailout for the crisis of between 400 and 500 billion. Instead of carrying a short-term higher debt to GDP ratio and investing to grow the economy to cover the cost over time, the incoming Conservative government in 2010 just couldn't let that crisis go to waste. So in his first budget, it's almost 10 years to the day to that first budget of George Osborne, he stepped up to the dispatch box and unleashed what was to become 10 years of harsh austerity alongside, people had it disguised, it was alongside not just austerity, but £100 billion worth of tax cuts to the rich and corporations, and yes, a grinding halt to investment in our basic infrastructure. And the result, this is the result. According to research undertaken by the University College London, many of you saw, there was the 120,000 extra deaths attributed to cuts in spending on health and social care. And it's important to remind people that prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, just what the Tories had done to our public services and our economy overall. In health, 17,000 hospital beds cut. There were 90,000 vacancies in the NHS and 100,000 jobs in social care were unfilled. Privatisation, outsourcing, and the failure to invest produced escalating levels of insecure work, pay freezes, and productivity stagnating across the economy. So consequently, at the beginning of this year, weekly wages were still below the pre-banking crisis levels. Savings were at record lows, and household debt was described in 2019 as at crisis levels. So after 10 years of austerity for the 99%, but wealth and asset accumulation by the rich, we found ourselves in a situation where our public services were significantly under-resourced and profoundly ill-prepared to face the pandemic. And individuals and their families were lacking just the elementary financial resilience to avoid financial hardship. If you recall, with many at the beginning of the pandemic, facing the risk of no income coming in and no savings to fall back on, and then being forced to choose between their health or hardship in whether to continue in whatever work was available. But what now? Well, just as the pandemic has had the clinical effect of exposing people's health vulnerabilities, so it's also exposed many of the basic flaws of our economy and society. The denial of resources to our public services, the failure to value, respect and reward the very people whose roles we rely upon for our safety and even survival, the precarious financial situation in which the vast majority of our people live, the insecurity and the lack of control over our working lives, the lack of any power over decision-making at every level, from the level of the firm through to national government itself. The inability to hold leaders to account when they're so patently dissemble and refuse to abide by the rules the 99% of us are expected to adhere to. All this, I think all of this is now being exposed more openly, more clearly. And it's culminating in the beginnings of, only the beginnings, but the beginnings of a growing appreciation of the need for change. So we need to look at some of the lessons that people are learning. Some lessons about the values we seek to uphold, they've clearly been learned or relearned as a result of this crisis. I think the first has been demonstrated by the majorities, the large majorities' adherence to the lockdown. It's that lesson that actually we do all have a responsibility for one another, and that it's collective action and solidarity that's seeing us through this crisis. For the 99%, we really are all in this together. But we've also been taught the lesson more clearly in this crisis that there are some in the 1% that believe they are above the rules that apply to the rest and can act with impunity. I think the second lesson that people are, I think, have relearned is that actually the state in all its forms plays a vital role in our society. That in the last instance, actually we all rely upon, whether it's from the local council organising the supply of food, the NHS and carers saving lives, the DWP and HMRC administering the financial support scheme, the schools looking after the children of key workers, the range of emergency services through, yes, to the decision making and administration of the national government. Confirmation of this essential role of the state in the crisis just flies in the face of all those on the right who you recall in recent years have been advocating so vehemently small state theories to reduce the role of the state in order, well, their objective is cut the state, cut public services, and in that way you can provide the tax cuts. And yes, through privatization, the profiteering opportunities to the rich and corporations. I think the third lesson as well is that never again can any Tory chancellor or commentator on the right argue that the resources cannot be found when they're needed. For so long, we've been told that we cannot do things because the resources are not available or can't be found. When to deal with this pandemic, even a right-wing, staunch neoliberal advocate, Tory chancellor, was forced to find the resources needed and found them. The argument will still, though, be put to us that this is a special crisis, this is a one-off, and the resources had to be found. Well, I think our response to that, of course it's a crisis, with the FT calculating 60,000 deaths, and the resources had to be found, of course. But surely it was a crisis also with 120,000 deaths being associated with austerity. We know now that with the political will, the resources could also have been found and also can be always found in the future. The argument no longer stands up that we haven't the resources to create a new future for ourselves. So what is our task now? For those of us on the left and progressives, our task is to discuss and plan the economy and the society that will translate these lessons learned during the pandemic into a vision for the future of our society and into the concrete policy program needed to achieve that vision of society. Now, just look back on past experience of when we tried to do this. In the 1980s, when Thatcher was rolling out the first stage of the neoliberal program, it was called monetarism then. The left developed and campaigned around the alternative economic strategy. It provided the basis for offering an alternative policy program, but actually, yes, if implemented, would have prevented the devastation caused by the Tory administrations of the 1980s and 1990s. And whilst the alternative economic strategy provided a coherent alternative strategy, despite all the hard work of its advocates, the balance of political forces, both, yes, within the Labour Party and across the political spectrum, meant that it was not taken up or implemented. However, I have to say that many of its underlying principles and much of its sense of direction fed into the thinking which later underlay the Labour manifestos of 2017 and 2019, and interestingly replicated by both Keir Starmer and Becky Long-Bailey in their policy statements published in their bids for the Labour leadership. So just to kick off the discussion, let's sketch out what could be the contents of a new alternative economic strategy for the present day. An alternative economic strategy which objectives was always about the redistribution of power and wealth to achieve equality within our society, what some have called Equinomics. Let's just go through those central tenets. First of all, as we go forward, let's make it absolutely clear there can be no return to austerity. We've already seen the warning signs of the Tories in government at the moment testing the water on the public reaction to arguments for a new round of austerity, when they briefed the media on the potential of a 2-year pay freeze or another round of public spending cuts. But I think actually more astute tacticians on the right are now willing to accept a continuing fiscal stimulus to avoid large-scale austerity, as they recognise the public won't accept it anymore. But they'll only accept and support a fiscal stimulus as long as the major benefits of that stimulus flows towards restoring profits, not wages, and to management incomes and shareholders and not to workers. And I think they do appreciate now how difficult it would be to convince an electorate worn down by a decade of austerity to accept another decade of wage freezes and crumbling public services. As a result, elements of the Conservative right have become Keynesians, but Keynesians with a selfish purpose. And indeed, what's been strikingly revealed by the pandemic is that level of financial insecurity felt by so many of our people, whether they're in work or receive Social Security support. They've endured the direct effects of the slowest recovery from a recession and the slowest wage growth in over a century. And it's led in many instances to an associated epidemic of hardship, stress, and mental health problems. Our aim should be to create a society where financial insecurity is eradicated. I think there's 2 basic steps we could support that would go some way to eradicate this insecurity. The first is the introduction of a minimum earnings guarantee, set at a level that will allow for a decent standard of living, whether in work or unable to work. In this way, we could lift people out of poverty, but also give them guarantees for the future, which lifts the level of insecurity that has caused so many problems of stress and mental health within our society. And some have argued for the bringing in of a basic income, and I'm a supporter of a basic income. However, I accept at the moment that not all on the left are convinced, and at the moment it may be a leap too far for some. So that's why in the Labour manifesto I proposed a few pilots to test and possibly prove its viability. But for those who are advocates of basic income, let me just say this: the earnings guarantee could be an interim step towards realising that ambition. Certainly, it then moves us towards if the potential of pilots in the future may be able to overcome some of the remaining sceptics. But in the meantime, a minimum earnings guarantee would go some way to alleviating the financial problems that so many individuals and families within our society face. The second is to, again, just recognise increasingly during the pandemic, people have identified the important role trade unions play in representing and protecting us all. Many have had no experience of trade unions up until now, have suddenly realized what a trade union is and the role it can play, and acknowledged and appreciated that it's the trade unions who've been the loudest voices demanding wage support and a return to work only when it's safe to do so. And the result has been that actually workers are turning to unions for representation and protection. Unions like the NEU have reported significant numbers of new members joining them. And the crisis has confirmed to many more what we know, is that the best way of protecting yourself at work is to join a trade union. So the second step in tackling insecurity, many now feel, is the installation of trade union rights that can end exploitation and give workers a real say in their workplace. I'm an enthusiastic advocate of the comprehensive program of employment rights brought forward last year by the Institute of Employment Rights, an organization that's done groundbreaking work in the most difficult times and with limited resources. Amongst much else, the implementation of their program will entitle every worker to their employment rights from day one of employment, restore the basic right of workers to withdraw their labor, enable wages to be determined by sectoral collective bargaining, end zero-hour contracts, and yes, prevent the abuses that have grown so extensively in the gig economy. I just think seeking a voice on basic security at work is not a lot to ask for. And that's exactly, I think, people are waking up to at the moment, and the role that trade unions can play. I just give some examples recently about the need for that security in the face of the operation of some companies. In the case of British Airways, for example, in my constituency, they're making 12,000 of its workers redundant. And then they're using the pandemic as an excuse to dismiss the remaining 30,000 and offer them re-employment, but re-employment on lower wages and worse employment conditions. Or the example of P&O equally exploiting the pandemic, sacking 900 UK seafarers and recruiting Filipino workers on £4.50 an hour. The nationality of it is irrelevant. The issue is these workers are being exploited simply to cut wages and undermine working conditions. That's why we need a trade union program that will restore trade union rights in this country. But also it is about ownership too. So we have to also recognize that security at work comes from being able to influence decision-making effectively. And that's why worker representation on boards is so critical, to ensuring the voice of workers is not just heard, but plays a key role in decision-making. But actually influence also generally flows from ownership. And the proposal we developed in the Labour Party for inclusive ownership schemes, providing 10% of company shares to be owned collectively by workers in a company, was not just about securing a fair share of rewards within that firm, but it was also securing a say over key decisions. And it's interesting just how enthusiastically that proposal has been taken up in the USA at the moment. The pandemic has reconfirmed also in many people's minds that there are many basic services that are so important to the quality of our lives that they shouldn't be treated as commodities to be bought and sold, provided only to those that can pay, but instead they should be provided universally and resourced by universal contributions. So let's build upon that emerging appreciation of the role of universal basic services as we create our post-pandemic society. Of course, it's true, as I've said, never again should we allow the NHS and social care to be so underfunded that they are stretched to near breaking point each winter, let alone in this pandemic? But also how ill-prepared they were for when this epidemic started, and how ill-prepared they will be again if we allow the Tories to cut them for future epidemics. So let's make it clear that a prerequisite is a commitment to the fully funded NHS and the establishment, as we planned, of a national care service. But also it is about ending the creeping and now large-scale privatisation of our NHS and care service that we've witnessed over recent decades. What else came to light in terms of public services in this pandemic is that the government itself has to recognise that private companies have been incapable of maintaining our public transport services. Even this Tory government has been forced effectively to nationalise our railways and fund our bus routes through taxation just to enable them to survive. So the question asked is, why should this take place only in times of crisis? Bringing them back into an integrated national and local service would open the door step by step to public transport becoming a universal service, actually provided free to all as part of the drive to environmental sustainability. And we come on to one of my favourite policy areas at the moment, the provision of full fibre broadband. It was attacked and ridiculed as full fibre Marxism when I launched the idea of internet connectivity as a universal basic service last November. We now have people shouting at their computer screens as their signal fails as a result of lack of investment by the private sector. And increasingly, there's a recognition that in the 21st century, connectivity has become essential to our way of life. To be without it, as people are finding, isolates people, limits their lives, and impoverishes their lives overall. So I want to bring back on the table the discussion about publicly owned, free at the point of need, full fibre broadband implemented right the way across the country. And we'll see who's laughing now. As Tony Benn always quoted on new ideas, he said, first they laugh at you, then they condemn you, and then eventually they claim it was their idea in the first place. I think that's what we're about to see in terms of broadband. So public ownership of these universal services ensures that people have access to key services that are essential to having a decent quality of life and yes, a thriving community. But it also plays a wider role in ensuring that large sections of our economy are properly democratically managed in all our interests for the long term and on the basis of what is needed, not what in the short term can secure profits for the management tier or the shareholders. And I think over the years, certainly recently, the debate on the role of universal basic services has been reopened now at scale. And the argument is straightforward. The more services are no longer treated as commodities, the greater the opportunity there is for overcoming the grotesque levels of not just poverty, but also inequality within our society. So I think we should seize the opportunity now of bringing forward the discussion of the detail of how public ownership works, including the role of cooperatives and community wealth building in providing a range of these basic services. And we've opened that debate on energy and housing and water. To affect the extension of universal basic services, though, depends to an extent on establishing a fair taxation system. When we raise the question of taxation, the constant refrain from the right, certainly recently, is that the rich are paying their share and more of income tax. True, they pay more income tax, but it's simply because they earn more. Let me just make 3 points. When other taxes are taken into account, the proportion paid by other groups of earners across the spectrum is roughly the same. Plus, remember, the rich pay, on the latest figures, 34% of their income in taxes overall, while the poorest pay 40%. I witnessed at a recent webinar at the Resolution Foundation, the research, which has been partially published this month and will be more completely published in June, that actually identify that when it comes to the taxation of their assets, the rich have gained dramatically over recent years, especially from spurious tax reliefs. So that's why, alongside the measures to crack down on tax evasion and tax avoidance, we've advocated and should still advocate not just increasing taxation on the highest earners, but also treating capital gains in the same way as income and scrapping spurious tax reliefs like the entrepreneur's allowance, the welfare state for the rich, and the corporations. So put together all these policies and they contribute, I believe, to establishing a society where we will move towards reducing inequality. Equinomics, the use of economic policy to achieve equality overall. I think what's both encouraging and exciting at the moment is that despite the horrendous experience of the loss of the election in December, after a short period of, well, can only be described as mourning, I suppose, so many people have picked themselves up and thrown themselves into current campaigns and envisioning this for the future, the society we want to create, the economy on which it will be based. And there's a growing awareness that the way we address the crisis of this pandemic actually is just a dress rehearsal for how we tackle the biggest crisis of all, the existential threat of climate change. The same principles and values that have come to the fore in the pandemic are the same ones we should apply to addressing the next crisis, the climate change crisis. The principles and values of solidarity, the recognition that collective action is at the core of any strategy, the roles of the democratic state, public ownership and control, large-scale investment, raised and harnessed through a resourcing through a fair system of taxation. I think what's been uplifting is the work that is now going on apace by some wonderfully creative people to rapidly consolidate the detailed program that we can have confidence in to prevent the looming climate catastrophe. The work that's been undertaken on the Green New Deal and the Green Industrial Revolution by large numbers of people now is just creative, pragmatic, and readily implementable. Just in conclusion, the pandemic and climate crises have reinvigorated the debate about what we value and the challenge to our challenge to the dominance of, well, GDP, gross domestic product, as the measure of our society. And various new initiatives are now underway. Some are under the rubric of Build Back Better, which I've supported, except that, like many others, I don't want to build back or go back or return to normal or rebuild or reclaim, because it was that society, that form of economics, that created the crisis we're now desperately facing. I want a new future. And to be frank, I'm going to spend the rest of my life to secure it. And I hope to meet you on that path on the way. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, John. That was a really fascinating lecture on the crises we face at the moment and the various ways we might try to overcome these chronic problems. And we've got an awful lot coming into the chat at the moment. So are you happy if I feed a couple of questions to you at a time? I'm trying to make these as representative as possible from what's coming through. I've got the first one on Scotland. How can the Labour Party gain more traction in Scotland as a class response to nationalism? And then I've got a second one, which I think you have covered a little bit towards the end, but I'll put it to you now. Are there opportunities for the green economy coming out of this pandemic? start with those two.
Okay, let me do it. Scotland's an incredible challenge. We have to recognise the way in which, in the recent past, the way in which nationalism has taken hold there. And all of my life, I've been campaigning on the basis of class rather than nationalism. And I think that's what we have to continue to do. But we have to demonstrate that we have a clear program of how we can implement and bring forward policies that can affect people's lives and transform them. And I don't think we've been able to sufficiently so far. And it's going to take a large amount of it's grassroots work on the ground in Scotland in bringing people together in the communities to talk through the issues that they face and the policies that they consider will be the solutions to those problems. And in that way, we can reroute ourselves back into the community. And actually, that's what Richard Leonard and the Labour Party up there at the moment are doing. But it is tough. It is tough because when nationalism takes hold, it's very difficult to reverse that trend. But our argument always has to be that we're a class, and and it's a working class that transcends all borders, and that the best way in which we transform the economic system that imperils many people's existences and undermines the quality of their lives and divides us often is if we actually work as a class to transform that economic system and take democratic hold. Again, I think what we'll see in this coming period is the growth, well, we've seen it already, the growth of nationalist, I suppose, spirit feeling in Scotland in particular, as a revolt against the Boris Johnson administration. And I think what we've got to do is make sure that we're working alongside our colleagues and comrades in Scotland to do everything we can to expose, yes, the Johnson regime and all that it stands for, but also to make sure that we're demonstrating in opposition we're united and we work in solidarity. And it's through solidarity across and refusing to recognize borders breaking up that solidarity that we can achieve change. But I don't underestimate. The number of meetings that I've done in Scotland demonstrate to me that actually once constitutional politics take over, it's very difficult then to win the argument around solidarity and class solidarity. And a lot of the debate that goes on is around institutional relationships rather is about the reality of the supply of housing, the investment in the health service, the wages and conditions at work and the rights of workers. I don't underestimate that, but it is difficult. In terms of what's happening with regard to the green economy, as I say, as we come out of this crisis, our job now is to make sure people recognize that we're now going to face the big one. We're facing it already, and we're already seeing the consequences of that in some of it, particularly in the global south. I'm amazed at the scale of the work that's gone on partly as a result of the renewed architecture of think tanks that we now have. And that's one of the benefits of the last 5 years, that we now have a viable architecture of left think tanks in particular that are developing these ideas. There's coalitions forming around how we develop those ideas into pragmatic policies and how they can then be convincing on the ground to people to support them. And I think it's working. But what we've got to do is, I think, always recognize that the climate catastrophe and therefore the policies to tackle the climate catastrophe have to be central to all our work now and everything that we do. All of our economic policy making now has got to be on the basis that the overriding objective has got to be prevent climate catastrophe. If you look at some of the work that we did in opposition in the run-up to the last two elections, it was interesting. I thought we came a long way from a standing start. And if you remember when Jeremy Corbyn took over as leader, we inherited Labour Party policy, for example, that was supporting fracking. And that was supporting fracking as the next generation of of fossil energy supply. It was remarkable. We turned that round. We developed the ideas under Rebecca Long Bailey of the Green Industrial Revolution. And if you look at the investment proposals that we had for transport in particular, it was a radical change in terms of how we would develop a transport system which would not contribute towards climate catastrophe, but actually help in tackling it, including the development of energy. We mustn't let that fall back. In fact, we've got to take it, I think, quite dramatically forward in terms of the scales of investment that's needed. The whole ideas we had around the National Investment Bank was that National Investment Bank would be plowing its money into green environmental projects. Again, we've got to make sure we develop onto that. One other area that really never got the coverage or publicity or attention it deserved, some of you may remember, we commissioned George Monbiot and a team of people like Shrubshaw and others to look at land policy and how we could use policy on land to assist us in tackling climate change, but also assist us in tackling inequality of ownership within our society as well, and restoring democratic control to vast tracts of land that are owned by the private sector and wealthy. Again, all of those policies we're being developed on, if we're in government, we'll be implementing them. We're not in government, so what we've got to do now is band together and win the argument, but we'll do that through solidarity. And I think what's wonderful is that the solidarity that's taken place right across, not dependent on political party, but actually working across different campaigning organizations and parties to enable that to happen. I also think when this lockdown is over, we do need to get back on the streets again. I supported Extinction Rebellion, and I think where necessary, direct action has got to be part of that mechanism for forcing the agenda on this issue so it's prioritized again.
Thank you. I've got a couple more coming through. One, Dave Ward of the CWU is advocating a programme for change shared by trade unions working together on a common agenda. What are your thoughts on this? And another one on the media. How does the left wing stand up to the mainstream media? A chronic challenge. Left wing policies seem to sit well with the electorate, but they're always turned against us by the right wing press.
On Dave Ward's programme, we've worked closely with Dave throughout. What Dave has been an ardent advocate of making sure that we mobilise the trade union movement in a concerted way, trying to make the TUC much more effective than that maybe it's been in past years, and I think it has. The programme it came out with in recent weeks, particularly with regard to tackling the pandemic crisis, but looking beyond that, I think has really demonstrated the TUC as back in action again now under Francis O'Grady. But also, if you look at what's happening in terms of the trade union coordinating group, the left trade unions coming together to campaign together. Some of the Zoom meetings that have been held under the TUCG banner have been really, I think, just superlative examples of solidarity. So trade unions supporting one another. The best example of that is the way that trade unions have supported the NEU, particularly around their schools reopening campaign. And I think that's the way forward now. When one trade union plants its banner and calls for support, automatically it should be given. And that's the sort of role that Dave has been advocating, where unions support one another, both in terms of campaigning, but also in the development of policies. And in particular, obviously, the CW has been an ardent supporter of the arguments we've been putting forward for a trade union rights program that restores trade union rights within this country. So again, it's interesting, isn't it, how CWU has become one of those unions that, yes, looks after its members and works hard, really represents them, is superb in negotiations and willing to take employers on if necessary. But actually they go beyond just their own sectional interest. They go beyond their own industry in true acts of solidarity with others. And they look beyond the longer term policy making as well. Again, I'm just so pleased if one of the things that we've helped to bring about in the recent years is that architecture of thought through the think tanks, but also what Dave and others have done, people like Mark Sawatka and what's happening, and Kevin Courtney and Mary Bassett and NEU, is that they're now using their trade unions to develop ideas again. The unions themselves have become think tanks in their own right, which is terrific. Let me just go to the media then, because this is this is it's a real issue we've got to face up to. I said this anecdote for the first time in a Zoom meeting the other day when Jeremy was going for the leadership, and we were trying to get him on the ballot paper on the Sunday before the Monday when he was supposed to get the nominations in. We thought we'd packed in about 6 o'clock, and that day we'd phoned everyone we possibly could, and I went off to the Globe Theatre to watch a Shakespeare play. It was one of those ones with blood and gore all over the stage. Anyway, halfway through in the interval, I get a phone call from Seb, Jeremy's son, saying Jeremy's really anxious. We could win this, and it was his Garden of Gethsemane moment, really, which I love him for, really, because he didn't want is in any way to do something for any form of personal ambition. But I said to Seb, look, don't worry. If he gets anywhere near number 10, the security service will assassinate him anyway. And it was a joke. But actually, they didn't assassinate him. They just assassinated his character through the media year after year after year. And it was just at times it was relentless. Well, it was relentless throughout. At times it was really vicious and nasty, and other times it was farcical. Some of you may remember that Jeremy was, one story came out that Jeremy was a Czech spy and I was a KGB agent. It was just remarkable. So some of it was farcical, but it was daily, day after day after day, relentless from the media. Because how do we resolve that? How do we confront that? Well, first of all, in terms of, I have a group around me that I bring to ask their advice of, and it includes people like Greg Fowler and Justin Schlossberg, Ken Loach, and others. And the first step is, to be frank, you have to be professional in the way that you deal with the media. You don't lead with your chin. And I think we learned that to a large extent, but it was always difficult. The second is you create your own media, you create your own climate as of opinion as well. And the one thing that we had in the run-up to 2017 general election was the use of social media on a scale that others on the left hadn't in past years, because it virtually didn't exist. And up until 2017, actually, I think we led on that. In 2017, 2019, we fell back because the Tories learned the lessons of social media and they were able to invest so much more in it. That doesn't mean to say we can't be more effective at using the whole range of social media and other cultural forms as well. The one thing that we've got that they haven't is, of course, mass membership with a whole range, and mass support with a whole range of different forms of creativity. We also actually, one of the things about using the mainstream media more professionally is the one thing that I always advocated was live media, because at least on live media, you have that few minutes in which you can get your message across no matter what. Often even on live media, though, they'd tape it and then distort the coverage of it later. But that's one of the things we have to confront. We should open up the debate now as well about the sort of media that we want in a democratic society in the future. And that does mean about how we tackle the monopoly or oligarchical ownership of the media in the future. But it's always going to be tough. And, it wasn't just Jeremy. They've done it to every Labour leader over the years, and we just have to try and cut through that. The one thing they haven't got, though, actually, because we reinvented word of mouth as a form of political communication on a scale that our opponents have never seen before. And the one thing that they haven't got is a huge mass membership, either in the Labour Party or also in our trade union movement and in our campaigning organisations and in the various mobilisations that we can undertake. And we've got to resort to that. What I found incredible yesterday was the scale of the turnout, even in this country, of young people protesting against the murder of George Floyd. And it just shows you how people can be mobilized around an issue and how rapidly they can. And I think that's what terrifies the establishment.
Thanks, John. Actually, I've got a question related to that just here. What policies can be implemented to reduce institutional racism and violence within our justice system?
We've always advocated let's start from the first base. We've always advocated, first of all, that we have to influence young minds. And that's why some of you may remember way back in the GLC period, we were advocates then of the promotion of Black history, understanding and celebration of the BAME community's history in this country. And we wanted to do that through our schools. It's got to be inherent within our educational system, within our curriculum. And I've had lots of emails from young people over the last 24 hours that's become one of the central demands. I'm meeting one of the groups, so I'm trying to meet one of the groups that are advocating the curriculum changes that we need on that. I thought we'd come a long way on that, and we certainly clearly haven't from what I've heard. So I think within our educational system, it's important that we insert into the curriculum a real discussion around a real history of our country, a real history of our people, and also a real history, I have to say, of racism within our society over generations. And that enables our young people then to talk about how they tackle it. And in some ways, I rely upon the youth now to take us forward on this issue, teaching older generations what life should be like. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in terms of what happens within the services that are provided to us, whether it be police or prisons or elsewhere, what we've got to ensure is accountability. You know, the Prison Officers Association is a bit of an example for some of the work that can be done. I can remember when the POA look back on its history, the allegations about the infiltration of the POA years ago by some elements on the right with extremely right-wing attitudes and views. But it took a trade union leadership that has transformed the POA into an incredibly progressive union, in which has led in some instances on tackling inequalities and tackling racism as well. And remember, that was undertaken by their first Black president only a few years ago. So you can see, working through the trade union movement in particular, we can establish levels of education, development of policy, but also levels of accountability too. And I think that's the way forward. Sunlight is always the best form of disinfectant. So openness and transparency and accountability is the way in which we can democratically ensure we can hold our institutions to account. But I also have to say that, you know, there's a whole range of organizations that I've worked with over the years, like Inquest, I quoted Inquest, who have always been under-resourced and not in some ways not respected either sometimes. We've got to ensure that those organizations within civil society that can enable people to be empowered and supported, particularly when they're taking legal actions, but also can be empowered and supported when they're seeking to hold the systems to account and introduce reforms. We've got to ensure that those civil society organizations are properly funded and properly supported as well, and recognized within our systems too. Look at what NAPO is doing at the moment as well in terms of the probation officers. They've been privatized, and it looks as though the Tories now, it's been such a disaster, the Tories are going to have to bring them back into some form of public ownership and democratic control. But look at what NAPO has done over the years in trying to ensure that within the whole justice system, there's a recognition of the grotesque levels of racism that has been experienced over the years. And what they've done is developed a whole set of policies and built it into the training of probation officers, which has enabled them to confront it. And again, it is about, often it's the members of the BAME community within those trade unions that have led the way, and I just pay nothing but tribute to them.
Before we move on to the next question, that I've been inundated with comments in the chat to give the Morning Star an honourable mention with regard to the left-wing press and media, our only daily socialist newspaper. I've got a couple of quite enormous questions here, John. The first being, how many of your ideas are accepted by the current shadow cabinet? And the second, which I guess is related, is that what narrative do we need to persuade the current Labour leadership and then the electorate to support this after the 2019 election result?
All of the current shadow cabinet stood on the last, I think all of them, certainly stood on the last manifesto, and most of them on the previous manifesto in 2017. I've not heard so far any major disagreements on policy. And as I said when I spoke, both Keir and Becky Long Bailey, in the literature that they produced, largely supported the policy programme that Jeremy and I and the party advocated in the last general election. So I haven't seen any dissent from that, but obviously things will move on, and the party will look at and discuss the policies that it needs in the coming period and in the run-up to the next general election. And that's the right thing to do. I want to ensure actually that we move on from the 2017-2019 manifestos, because I don't think in some areas they were sufficiently radical. So there will be a policy debate, and the National Policy Forum that exists within the party at the moment is going through a bit of a discussion online at the moment. I've been holding various webinars and Zoom meetings to discuss policies. So our job on the left and the progressive movement is to make sure we create a climate of opinion in which everything we're advocating is accepted. One is common sense. It's the old Gramsci thing. It's about hegemony. It's about making sure you win the argument and your ideas are all pervasive, so that whoever is leader of the Labour Party or in shadow cabinet or wherever in the party recognises that actually to make sure they can mobilise the Labour Party itself and then also win the next election is on the basis of the policies that we've been able to convince people are common sense. One area where I think we've got to be more radical is around, as people have raised, the issue of climate change. It's coming upon us so rapidly now that some of the timescales and objectives that we were seeking are out of date, and they're no longer the ones that will ensure that we overcome this climate catastrophe that faces us. So I'm looking to see how much more radical we need to be to enable that to happen. So it'll be an open and democratic debate. And the key issue for me, and I say this time and time again, for those people who might be worried that there's some form of change in direction, the key issue is to, one, stay within the party or join the party to make sure that we build a majoritarian position for the policies that we advocate. And that then, as a result of that, we're able to hold our people to account on that basis. What was the other question, Mario? You'll have to unmute yourself, I think.
Sorry. I think you've answered both of those with what you've just
okay
described.
let me mea culpa for not mentioning the Morning Star. Mea maxima culpa. Okay.
I think we've got one more that just is a nice positive one looking to the future. Can you share your thoughts on the future of young people's engagement in politics?
Look, at the moment, I think it's young people are just leading the way. When Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, he was an inspiration to large numbers of young people join the Labour Party and getting involved in a whole range of political campaigning, etc., which was fantastic. But actually, they've had the involvement of young people in politics and in all its forms actually has a sort of has a momentum. I don't want to use the momentum word in terms of organisation, but has a momentum of its own now. And young people now, I think they're in a situation where they're not going to take it anymore if they think something is wrong. And we saw that yesterday. You know, those turnouts yesterday, I was really worried because of the pandemic and the issue around social distancing. I was worried for them, but their strength of feeling was so strong that they poured out into the streets. And that's happening not just on the issue that we saw yesterday, but a whole range of different issues as well, as we saw on the environment with Extinction Rebellion and others. And actually we're seeing it too within the trade union movement now. The new generation is coming forward, and I think they're setting an example for all of us, really, on the dynamism that there is out there. The key issue is to ensure that we give people confidence all the time, that by mobilizing in that way that we can see and secure change. And I think that's the key issue for us, is making sure that we identify the key objectives that we want to achieve, that we move those on, and we give all the backing we possibly can. And part of that, is winning every argument, so that when young people are mobilizing, they have all the arguments behind them when they're on the doorstep, or when they're in meetings, or when they're on the street, or when they're in social groups or in their families. And I think that's part of the role. And I'm more confident now that we can do that because of the scale of the work, intellectual work that's gone on. And the Marx Memorial Library is part of that as well, is making sure the information is out there. Social media has helped us. It's been a nightmare in some of the trolls on Twitter and that sort of thing, but it has given us the ability to communicate directly and mobilize directly in a way that we maybe never had on this scale before. So I think the whole era for young people now is incredibly fruitful.
Thank you. Well, we've certainly got a lot to work towards and organise for, haven't we? And we really look forward to inviting you back to the Marx Memorial Library in person in the not too distant future, hopefully at perhaps a reconvened AGM. So thanks everyone for logging on. We'll be posting this recording up on our website tonight or tomorrow morning. And I just want to really encourage you all to take a look at the Marx Memorial Library's work. We've got a couple of forthcoming events, launching our journal on the 18th of June with Andrew Murray, Maxine Peake and Mary Davis. And we've got a panel on historical memory and the fight against fascism just a few days later on the 22nd of June. So do check out what we're up to. As John says, we're playing an important part in this movement at the moment, particularly in the field of education. So thank you.
Good to see you all. Good to hear you all.